Good evening. This is Sunday, January the 28th of 2024. Hope everybody's had a good day. We've started out a new year and we're uh, trying to get a few things accomplished. We had a good service today at Bethel AME Church in Corsicana. If you hadn't looked at it online, I hope you will. We had a good official board meeting. And then I attended the first meeting for the year of Corsicana's Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance. It was held this time at First Independent Baptist Church. Tonight I want to review a book, a very good book. It's called How the Arabian Nights Inspired the American Dream, 1790 to 1935, by Susan Nance. And this book it deals with a lot of things that I have dealt with in my personal research and writing and some of the lectures I've given over the years, and my interest in fraternal organizations and various religions and their relation to U.S. history and world history and to culture in general. In the preface of the book, the writer says the careers of entertainers from the Middle East, complicated by the war on terror, the nation's often troubled relations with various governments in the Muslim world, and the debate over the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. These things are definitely complicated. This book, by the way, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2009. It's now 2024, and this is even more so today. Of course, this is written before the recent war began between Israel and Hamas. And it brings out some interesting points how certain terms are used. Back in ancient times, what we call Iran today was called Persia. And these terms are used very differently today. We never speak about going to war with Persia. The word Iranian today denotes national security concerns, while Persian denotes provider of contented consumer experiences. One can be very up in arms against Iran and have their house decorated with Persian rugs. And I've heard that there are some Persian Jews, and by the way, they refer to themselves as Persians, not Iranians, that are in the carpet business that take a great deal of pride in the work they do, and it's some very good work. I mean, if you know what Persian carpets look like, they're awesome. And not everybody in Iran is Muslim. The majority are there, but there have been a small group of Jews, and some of the original Zoroastrians remain in Persia as well. But this book focuses on the century and a half before the Cold War began. Its strategic concerns and political news came to define the Muslim world. And there, between 1790 and 1935, poets, travelers, admirers of Sufism, which is Muslim mysticism, Eastern fraternal orders, the Ottoman merchants, the dancers, the acrobats, the magicians, missionaries from India, and Shriners, of which I am one, all became engaged in playing Eastern. The period, this begins with actually 1790, so the early days of America. And it became even more so after the Civil War. And playing Eastern included stories about affluent abundance, guilt-free leisure, spiritual truth, natural manhood, the mysteriously exotic, the feminine self-discovery, romantic love, racial equality, and the creative possibilities for individuation in a market economy. Yes, many, as we shall see, many non-whites saw a road to equality through Islam and some other non-Christian religions. At the same time, uh, many whites became fascinated with Eastern culture, and including the playing the part of Muslims in the shrine, while at the same time maintaining their belief in white supremacy. In 1978, Edward Said wrote a book called Orientalism, which was quite influential. And the Orientalists were academics, painters, writers, other Westerners who assembled and authorized Orientalism, often to the disadvantage of the actual lands and the people it described. Some had never been there, quite a few had never been there. And it was a very romantic, a very many times unrealistic understanding of the mystical East. Uh, it was so foreign and so exotic. The most numerous attempts by people in the U.S. to take the Eastern persona occurred before the American moment in the Middle East began in the 1930s. So most of them had not been there. And we did not see a lot of the developments today. Also, keep in mind, as far as the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, Israel, modern Israel, did not become a nation till 1948. And many fundamentalist Christians view that as a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. And thus, that has a tremendous impact on their view on Middle East politics. And but that occurred only in relatively recent years. And I first became a member of the Shrine in 1973. And this, interestingly enough, was close to the time of the oil crisis when Shriners reminded some people of the Saudi power elite. And crossing over is defined as creation of an artistically satisfying performance. They're also actually and financially viable by circus men, dancers, magicians, Lyceum lecturers, writers, and half-drunk parading Shriners. First time I ever went to a shrine dance, I told my late father about it. He asked me, "Do you have a bottle of whiskey?" No, of course not. That's just the impression he had that the way Shriners were. Some may be that way, but many of us do have Christian values, and we feel like abuse of alcohol is not appropriate for anyone. But the peoples and cultures of the Muslim world were real active places, peoples and traditions that intervened into global history, whether Americans liked it or not. There was a time that it was very possible to go from cradle to grave without meeting a Muslim, a Hindu, or a Buddhist. That's very rare today. Because people of these faiths are all over. Orientalists sought out ideal national and racial types with references to the root races and Indo-Aryan civilization. Some of that is found in the writings of Madame Helena Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical Society. She borrowed, in her early writings, she was greatly influenced by the French Kabbalist Eliphas Levi, the subject of my doctoral dissertation. The Masonic public made up the largest market for masculine Eastern persona in the nation. Some Masons had money. Some of us don't. But one place that Orientalism was really on display was the World's Columbian Exposition that met in Chicago in 1893, the Chicago World's Fair. The image of the wise men of the Masonic East was so prevalent by the 1870s and 80s that elite Masons could found a new order to lampoon Protestant interest in the Muslim world. The ancient Arabic order, Nobles of the Mystic Shrine, was founded by a physician, Dr. Walter Fleming, and an actor named Billy Florence. They were part of a group of men, most of whom were Masons, who met at a place called Knickerbocker Cottage in New York City. In the years after the Civil War, they were celebrating the preservation of the Union, and a craze went around about the number 13. These men would meet for lunch every day. They would sit down for lunch at exactly 12:13. There had to be exactly 13 people. There couldn't be 12, there couldn't be 14. They would sit down every day at 12:13. And out of this nucleus came a fun organization whose membership was initially limited to high-ranking Masons. As an actor, Billy Florence had traveled the world, and on one occasion he was in Marseille, France, in which he attended a play that was put on, and a lot of the leading citizens of Marseille were there. And at the end of the play, there was an initiation into a secret society. Billy Florence took notes and brought them back to Dr. Fleming and the others, and Dr. Fleming used Florence's notes and other sources as well to write the first ritual for the Shriners. And Mecca Temple of the ancient Arabic order, Nobles of the Mystic Shrine, which is now called Shrine International, was chartered in 1872. African Americans saw the Eastern world and the turban as a sign of promise for the future that spoke of the autonomy as a spiritual people, as consumers, and as citizens. Were there any African Americans in this original group of Shriners? No. At that time, there were very few, if any, African Americans who belonged to predominantly Caucasian lodges. They had their own lodges, Prince Hall affiliation, and some other groups that eventually broke off. But in 1893, the story is that John G. Jones and 14 other Black Masons were initiated into the Mystic Shrine by an Arab named Rofelt Pasha, who allegedly was part of the Grand Council of Arabia. And the initiation took place in Apollo Hall on State Street in Chicago. There's a lot of conflicting stories about that, and I, for many years, have had the theory that it's a good possibility that John G. Jones was taken in by a degree peddler posing as an Arab. But they went on to start the ancient Egyptian Arabic order, Nobles of the Mystic Shrine, the Prince Hall Shriners. And in 1894, the White Shriners knew Prince Hall Shriners existed, but they filed the first lawsuit in Atlanta, Georgia in 1914 to put them out of business. And there was battle back and forth. There was a number of lawsuits, and finally the great litigation climaxed June 3rd, 1929, involving cases in Houston, Texas, in which the U.S. Supreme Court declared that black men had the right to wear the fez and call themselves nobles of the mystic shrine. It was decided based on the concept of latches, which is a legal term for delay, that the white Shriners had been trying to claim copyright to the fez and to the scimitar and crescent and other emblems of the shrine. They knew about Prince Hall's existence in 1894. 20 years is too long to wait to claim an exclusive right. Tales of 1001 Nights was a popular story, and Arabian Nights became popular in Virginia right after the American Revolution, so this goes way back. And Americans became fascinated by some of these things. Between 1790 and the 1890s, Anglo Americans saw Arabian Nights as a literary classic that coexisted with the Bible. And you know the story of Aladdin and his lamp, the whole idea of instant wealth. Wouldn't we all like to have some of that? The land depicted the Arabian Nights in Egypt, from Egypt to Persia to India and China, had always been a global trade, had a global trade and travel across. Excuse me. But this was an age of discovery, Oriental Renaissance. In early America, there was some interest in the Quran and other works from the Islamic world. It's a well-known fact of history that President Thomas Jefferson had a Quran in his library. The so-called Oriental tales were read in rural Michigan, as well as in places like New York and Philadelphia. Abu bin Autumn, famous poem by James Henry Leigh Hunt, written in 1813. By the 1800s, many Americans were attracted to potentates, fakirs, dervishes, genies, wise men, and houris. A houri, sort of like a geisha girl. In 1853, the publisher and journalist George Putnam wrote, "We also are Aladdins, and focus the genie of the lamp are working." So interest in the Orient became quite profound. It was said that the Bible represented work, while the Arabian Nights represented play. Aren't they supposed to be kept in balance? Well, both could be found on many a bedside table. Eastern leisure at the time included pipe smoking, coffee drinking, I imagine tea drinking too, and conversation. Beginning of the 1850s, many young men in America developed a taste for smoking jackets and fezzes in gentlemen's lounges. And then they began to purchase the hookah. Hookah is an Oriental water pipe. Turkish shopkeeper Muhammad Effendi provided everything from jasmine pipe stem of Persia, from the altars, golden embroidery, Indian cashmere. 1853, Harper's Monthly reported turbans and pipes and slippers are bought better than on the boulevard of Paris. So all these things became quite popular. The Arabian divan is a studio where men could smoke, fez clad, on cushions surrounded by provocative sculptures. Well, there was actually any houris there. I imagine that would cost a little bit more. But anyway, Oriental rug sold in 1876, Philadelphia Centennial Exposition. You remember American independence in 1776? So we celebrated the centennial in 1876. Some of us are old enough to remember the U.S. bicentennial in 1976. And the sale of Oriental rugs boosted by the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. It was truly a fascinating event, quite a phenomenon. Most every nation of the world was represented, and the streets of Cairo was of quite a phenomenon there, with the belly dancers, with the all the different bazaars and Moorish type pavilions. And Sol Bloom, a Jewish American who later served in Congress, was director of the Midway. And though not held on the fairgrounds grounds itself, the World's Columbian Exposition included the world's parliament of religions, in which various religious faiths throughout the world were represented. The majority of the media attention was given to that of Vivekananda of India. On September 11th, 1893 was the kickoff of the World's Parliament of Religions, and Vivekananda brought the speech in which he said all religions are one. The harmony and brotherhood of September 11th, 1893 is a sharp contrast to the violence and intolerance of the September 11th, 2001. It was under largely Protestant influence control. It was the brainchild of Dr. John Henry Barrows, at the time pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Chicago. The only Muslim to speak was Alexander Russell Webb, who took the name Muhammad Webb. There was also Dr. George Washburn, president of Robert College, a Christian school in Constantinople, who spoke about Christianity and Islam. And Bishop Daniel Alexander Payne, Bishop Benjamin W. Arnett, both bishops in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, to which I have belonged for nearly 50 years. They were involved in the parliament, as was Fanny Barrier Williams, a Chicago Unitarian whose husband was an attorney. Those were the only three African Americans who participated. But people were exposed to world religions. People were opposed to world cultures. And people who had money to travel abroad did. Even those who couldn't travel abroad could afford certain things and doing what they call playing Eastern. October 1865, just a few months after the end of the Civil War, the review of William Alger's Poetry of the Orient appeared in The Nation, a magazine founded by the triumphant abolitionist who argued that Muslims had the right to protect religions, languages, and political and cultural traditions from Western pressure. And we don't know how many Muslims there were at the time. Some of the slaves brought from Africa were Muslim. We don't know how many, but some of them were. And no doubt some of the Muslim traditions were preserved in spite of slavery. The expression ex oriente lux, from the east comes light, was the motto of the transcendentalists during the 1840s. And there was a distrust at the time between East and West. And this book has so much good material in it, and I'm not going to be able to cover it all, obviously. In portrait of Oskianon, looked like a Turkish janissary intent upon annihilating the Russian bear. The janissaries were a military corps in medieval times, and many of the chaplains were members of the fascinating Bektashi order of dervishes, which had an influence upon the ideas of the Shriners. Thomas Hicks depicted the reclining fez-clad man named Bayard Taylor smoking a water pipe on a Damascus rooftop. Rob Morris was a prominent Masonic author. I read his book, Freemasonry in the Holy Land. He also wrote a book called The Faithful Slave, which was an anti-slavery novel. He's noted, among other things, being the founder of the Order of the Eastern Star. And one of Morris's main insights was that Masonry was not just a Christian tradition for whites, but was an international brotherhood of wise men that included Muslims. Masonry requires every man who petitions to be a believer in God, but there's no religious requirement besides that. The volume of sacred law is usually the Bible, but it can be the Quran, the Vedas, or other holy books that are accepted by the candidate for membership. Morris had great respect for Muhammad Rashid Pasha and Abd al-Qadir, two important Muslims in the East and who were Freemasons. He deals with Albert Rawson's work as a researcher, writer, and illustrator. Rawson sought to appeal to Protestant scholars who might or might not have actively had sympathy for Masonic interest in Eastern spiritualities. He was involved in the early days of the Shriners. Shriners claimed Abd al-Qadir as the great Sheikh Ali Temple of Mecca. The flow of immigrants to Ellis Island from the Ottoman Empire surged in the 1890s. This is the same time of the World's Columbian Exposition and some of these developments. And there were some Arabs who were involved in vaudeville. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 was called the preeminent moment of intercultural observation and adaptation. And this book points out, as I have pointed out previously, there were both white and black Shriners present at the fair. Did they visit the same temples? Did they fraternize together? No, not yet anyway. And it's been well documented, though, that there were times when white Shriners would sell their used supplies, especially when moving to a different location, to some black Shriners at cut rate. Some American visitors might entertain racist ideas about people they met at the fair, but were also fascinated and wanted to shop. So there's a contradiction in the way one feels about things. Ottoman leaders did not feel that dancing girls and dervishes, which are like the whirling dervishes or Sufi Muslims who have a very mystical dance they do, and they are considered heretical by many Orthodox Muslims. But the belly dancers and the whirling dervishes, Ottoman leaders didn't feel they represented the empire very well. Again, the Chicago Shriners were very prominent there, members of Medina Temple and others. On April the 28th of 1893, the Shriners participated in a parade in dedication of a mosque, probably irritating Muslims. And Shriners purchased a lot of Oriental supplies at the expositions. On Shriner Day, some Ottoman officials might have believed the Shriners were actually American Muslims, which they were not and are not. And one of the early temples was Islam Temple in Chicago. And when it was first started, there were probably very few Muslims in San Francisco. I say Chicago, it's Medina temples in Chicago, Islam temples in San Francisco. And there were probably not many Muslims in San Francisco. And those that did come, eventually, as they got more numerous, they see the sign. It probably happened that they would come there on a Friday wanting to make prayer. And this is not a mosque. It looks like one, but it's not. They eventually moved to San Mateo and changed their name because of some of the confusion involved. And since 9/11, some shrine temples have faced a lot of opposition because of the Arabic motif. It's said that the Shrine Arab Patrol was perhaps inspired by the Zouave troops of the Civil War, who also wore fezzes. They were Frenchmen for the most part. 1893 Shriners received inspiration and bought clothing and objects from real Arabs, Persians, and Turks who were there at the exposition. And Middle Eastern musicians inspired the Shriners to start an Oriental band. This book deals with the great litigation that I've written about. The year of 1929, the Shrine visit before the Supreme Court, the victory of Prince Hall Shrindom, the vindication. And then some African Americans wished to embrace Islam in the Moorish Science Temple and later the Nation of Islam, wearing fezzes, thus being mistaken for Shriners. So it worked both ways. Noble Drew Ali, the founder of the Moorish Science Temple, no doubt was influenced by Masonry and enshrined him. And the Moors criticized the disfigurement of the fez. They wore a plain red fez with a black tassel, no insignia at all. There's a story of a black Shriner who wore his fez to a Moorish Science Temple meeting. Noble Drew Ali removed that fez and placed a Moorish fez on his head, saying, "You no longer need this now that I am your prophet." The Oriental dancer seemed to embody the carefree, consumerist nature of the golden 90s. America definitely out of the power and Indian fighting stage, relaxed, a turn from the self-discipline of the 70s and 80s. Buffalo Bill had his Wild West show. In Chicago, they had the Wild East show. And people, for obvious reasons, became intrigued by the belly dancers. Eastern Dancer was a reflection of the beautiful and clever heroines on the 1001 Nights. The French term is danse du ventre, danse du ventre, belly dance, in Chicago. Sol Bloom, the director of the Midway, said when people learned about it, I had a gold mine. In Chicago, the Persian palace, contrary to Muhammad, promised houris without the necessity of dying for them. One denies oneself in this life, and one enters paradise and is tended to by the houris, the virgins of paradise. Now, they had it set up in Chicago where you could get that here. World's Fair Prize winner show was a Columbian Exposition spinoff in New York City. And exotic dancing became very popular. And later, Little Egypt became disgusted when the Danse du Ventre was morphing into striptease. She became famous at Coney Island, and there was more than one dancer who went by the name of Little Egypt. Coney Island became a real popular place. And the streets of Cairo at Chicago inspired a song, She Never Saw the Streets of Cairo, and also the Cairo Street Waltz. It is true the belly dance was introduced there, but the hoochie coochie that became the stock and trade of American amusement parks was not. And by 1910s, the development of the nude Oriental dancer taken place. Bruce St. Denis said, I identify myself in a flash with the figure of Isis. I knew that my destiny as a dancer had sprung alive in that moment. Denny Shawn School of Dance, and there were many popular developments and different dance forms and things that have drawn from this. And not everybody was impressed favorably. There's a list of a whole slew of critics here. In the late 19th, early 20th century, many swamis and yogis, along with Asian migrant workers, came to the United States. And I mentioned Vivekananda earlier. He gave that famous speech at Chicago, and he went on to found the Vedanta Society for Americans interested in Hinduism. Many individuals found meaning in their religions with the turban wearing spiritual men. And many American women saw in the Swami a rebuke of white male power and American modernity, premised upon it. There's a discussion here of Muhammad Webb, who was the second American known to convert to Islam. And he was Anglo-American, as was Reverend Norman. Reverend Norman in the 1870s went to Turkey as a Methodist missionary with the intent of converting the Turks to Christianity. But he went native. He became a Muslim. About 10 years later, Alexander Russell Webb followed and became known as Muhammad Webb. At the World's Fair, at the Parliament of Religions, he spoke on the spirit of Islam and the influence of Islam on social change. Perspectives on Eastern critique of Western materialism. Again, Vivekananda's influence was quite profound. Describes pseudo swamis and yoga for sale. What's the original stuff, the original unadulterated message, and those who package it and make money off of it? There's that case in every religion. And women attracted to sheiks reject the xenophobic fear of mongrelization. And many African Americans were attracted to Eastern religions because they came to associate Christianity so much with white supremacy. And charlatans were involved in scandals, money, and sex. There's nothing new under the sun. And keep in mind that the 1920s was not only marked by Yogananda, Paramahansa Yogananda, who was many years ago, I read his autobiography of a yogi. He, I think, was influenced somewhat by Vivekananda, but he founded the Self-Realization Fellowship, which is another expression of yoga in America. And the 1920s was marked by Yogananda, but also by Amy Simple McPherson's radio ministry in California, and Bruce Barton's depiction in The Man Nobody Knows of Jesus as an advertising man. Yogananda also admired the teachings of Christian Science and New Thought, adopted similar self-help terminology for Hindu mysticism. In May of 1926, Sufi and Shriner ads appear on the same page of the New York Times. That's quite interesting. Some had tried to link the Shriners with the Bektashi Order of Dervishes, but there's a lot of controversy of how much of that identity is correct. But Homegrown Swami was a sign of the promise for the future, amplification of identity to those marginalized by the economy, especially African Americans. A number of new religious movements were developed among African Americans between 1925 and 1935. Noble Drew Ali's Moorish Science Temple had many and does have much Masonic and shrine elements in it. And there's evidence that both W.D. Farrar and Elijah Muhammad at one time been associated with Noble Drew Ali, later founded the Nation of Islam or Black Muslims. And one optimistic teacher, Jovende Di Raja, has been called a Dale Carnegie in the turban. Dale Carnegie is the author of the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. In Chicago, the turbaned and bearded Prince Ali called himself the world's greatest prophet. Also, some discussion here of Black spiritualist, the mystic textbook of the Hindu occult chambers, further discussion of the great litigation involving the white and black Shriners, demonstrated how hard people would fight to gain the right to the mystic shrine costumes and performances, or for the right to adapt and innovate these practices and persona for themselves. The Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam are important for laying the groundwork and associating race pride and activism with Easternized self-preservation and with Islam. The Moorish Science Temple, the Nation of Islam, and other groups linked a social uplift with Eastern persona to blacks so long deemed social equality and respectability by so long denied social equality and respectability by American whites. It always seems so strange to me to see white Shriners wearing a fez with a scimitar and crescent on it, representing a religion that's always expressed equality, expressing such racially bigoted views. And Chicago South and West sides, Detroit and Harlem, were centers of African American new religions that identified their education and critiques of the Eastern persona. And I've taught courses in Black religion. I've stressed a lot of these things. I know during the 1920s in Harlem, they had what they called jackleg preachers. They were defined as those who combined the baptism of the Holy Spirit with the baptism of the streets of Harlem. Noble Drew Ali appeared to believe the melting pot might be forced open to allow blacks in as Asiatics. Noble Drew Ali charged with running a Moor temple racket, selling fake Muslim teaching and collecting a harem of women. Later, Elijah Muhammad was revealed, and that was one of the main reasons for the break with Malcolm X. It was revealed Elijah Muhammad had extramarital affairs in which he impregnated several secretaries. And think later about white religious leaders like Jim Crow, Jim Jones and David Koresh. When a person gets that kind of following, they can do what they want to. I know of a major American politician who's trying to do that right now, too. The Nation of Islam became a collection point for former Moors, black spiritualists, other politically active and spiritual people. Wallace D. Farrard, a mystery man who appeared in the Paradise Valley of Detroit in 1930. He brought Elijah Poole, who became Elijah Muhammad, into Islam. When Farrard disappeared in 1934, Elijah Muhammad took over. He led the movement until his death in 1975. In 1935, the Chicago Tribune claimed the members of the Nation of Islam were on public assistance. Their fezzes and red robes were rented. It could have been true in some cases, but I'm sure it wasn't in all cases. Noble Drew Ali had some experience with the circus industry and probably was a pretty skilled magician, which he employed in developing the Moorish Science Temple. Certainly the Shriners would press on through jesting, parades, but they earned respectability through hospitals and other charity work. Only African Americans would sincerely or exotic Oriental persona into the post-war period, determined to redefine race in America. And again, Americans enjoyed playing Eastern, finding meaning in some of these traditions. It was in 1925 that my favorite psychologist, Carl Gustav Jung, made a safari to Kenya, East Africa. And I understand there were a lot of different trips like that going on at the time. And people, in many ways, wanted to live dangerously. And at the time Carl Jung took that trip, he was 50 years old. He was right in the middle of his career. And he was from Switzerland. But he went to East Africa on safari, studied the cultures there, then went up the Nile River into Egypt. He also had spent some time in India. And no doubt his psychological theories, which had been European in origin, were greatly influenced by the time he spent in Africa, in India, and also in the United States among Native Americans. We're all in it together. How the Arabian Nights inspired the American dream. Inspire, it definitely did. And so many different subjects here. The Shriners, the Bektashi Dervishes, other Sufi orders, the Moorish Science Temple, the Nation of Islam, the World's Columbian Exposition, the World's Parliament of Religions, all these other things are fascinating to study and make world spirituality quite meaningful to all who will give it a try. Hope you've enjoyed this. I know this is longer than usual and I've rambled a lot, but the book has a lot to say. Have a good evening and a great week ahead. God bless.